she's still standing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Feel free to break out into song at any point.
This is
Not
the
you,
musical
Mom.
book tour.
Just you, Vanessa.
You break out in song.
We are so happy to have you here, the two of you. And we've got some questions from the audience that I know you wrote and I will get to. But first, I'd like to ask you about the theme of the book. You point out the women that you write. They're not superheroes. In fact, they're inspiring because they are human. Now, the elephant in the room is one amazing superwoman, Miss Nancy Pelosi. Yes. Is currently going through something right now. You wrote about Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who has faced off with presidents who have embodied sexism, which brings me to the question that's on all of our minds and on the TV right now. What do you think is going to happen with President Trump?
Well, let's just jump right in. But before I answer that, let me thank Pace and thank President Krislov and everyone who had anything to do with making this happen. Let me thank the Chappaqua Library and Joan and Pam and everybody who keeps the library going. We're so grateful to you. Thanks to Scattered Books, our local bookstore in Chappaqua, and to the Barnes & Noble store here on campus for helping to accommodate all of us tonight. And it's such a thrill to be with Vanessa because not only, as was said when she was introduced, she's local, she's Westchester, she's Chappaqua, but talk about a gutsy woman. Boy, you fit the definition, and we're so happy you're here, and your mother is here, and one of your daughters is here. Okay, so what's going to happen? I have to say that I thought Nancy Pelosi did a really extraordinary job this morning introducing what is a somber, deliberative debate about whether or not the impeachment clause in our Constitution should be applied to the current president. And I have a particular view on this because way back in 1974, I was on the staff that investigated President Nixon. And I was able to watch the debate that took place in the House Judiciary Committee then. And as Chelsea and I write about one of the members of Congress in particular who summed up what was at stake in that procedure, Barbara Jordan, with one of the great speeches of our past 100 years, I remember being very taken and moved by the seriousness that was exhibited by all the members of Congress, to the point that when the House Judiciary Committee voted, Republican House members voted for at least one of the articles of impeachment against President Nixon. They put, as we like to say and believe you should, country over party. So it looks very much as though the House itself will vote in favor of two articles of impeachment. There may be a very few Republicans, maybe at least one, Justin Amish, maybe somebody else who will vote for those articles of impeachment. There might be one or two Democrats who vote against one or all of the articles of impeachment. But the end result will be this very significant vote. And I am one of those who watched this with deep concern because of the national security implications of what the articles address, namely the president's behavior with respect to Ukraine. And the facts are not in dispute. This is not a he said, she said. This is, here's what happened. In fact, the president, his chief of staff, people who've worked for him, experienced nonpartisan diplomats, military officers, everyone has told the same story. And it is a story of abuse of power, using the office of the presidency to further not the nation's objectives, but his own personal political objectives. And that is exactly the kind of action that our founders warned us about. So I believe, Vanessa, that the vote either tonight or tomorrow will pass the 2 articles of impeachment, abuse of power, and contempt of obstruction of justice because of contempt of Congress. And then I know there's a debate going on about, when to send it to the Senate, which has to conduct the trial, because the impeachment is like an indictment, but the actual trial is, under the Constitution, left to the Senate. And it appears, based on what we know now, that Mitch McConnell wants to just, push it through, get to an acquittal, and then put it behind. But I think that where we stand now in the country is that enough people have paid attention that there is a majority in favor of the impeachment, namely the indictment, and there is even now a small majority in many of the polls in favor of a conviction. I don't think that's likely at the current state of affairs, but at least it shows that the American people have really understood why this is such an important moment in our history.
Understood? Yes? So we talked about Nancy Pelosi being a gutsy woman, and that's the theme of your book. First of all, I wrote a book with my mother. What was it like writing your book together? Did you write it separately in 2 different places? Did you guys know what you each were going to say?
Well, we started, Vanessa, with literally a list of hundreds of women that we wanted to include. And our editor gently and then increasingly less gently told us that no one would ever read a book of kind of hundreds of stories, and that, it would break a bookshelf. It would be so weighty. So then we narrowed down the list, and we were quite proud of ourselves. We got to just over 200, and we wrote more than 200 essays. Wow. And then our editor, again, really not gently this time, said, no, you have to further kind of narrow it down. And so we write about 103 women or groups of women in the book, and that was really challenging because we did feel so connected and kind of inspired and galvanized, especially by the women whose stories we had written. But thankfully, it wasn't terribly contentious. I mean, there were a few times where we were really like, no, we have to include her. We have to include her. You have to give one up so I can include her. But what was really surprising to me, and it shouldn't have been, and we've talked, a fair bit about this because I think it is still amusing, especially to me as the daughter, and maybe this was your experience, Vanessa, that, because we are of a different generation, we do write differently. And so my mom still writes longhand, like on white and yellow legal pads. Like she still writes longhand. And, oh, wow. Wow.
My people, thank
you. Okay, I hope that I also maybe get some similar response when I talk about the fact that we live in 2019 and I use Word and Google Docs. Okay, I think that there was more applause for that. And so, Vanessa, it was challenging in a way that I hadn't anticipated because my mother would send me photos of her handwritten pages and say look, here's Barbara Jordan, photo 1, page 1, photo 2, page 2. And then she'll say but it was a scanning app, but I still received it as a photo attachment. And I would send her I thought really nicely flag documents with comments of here's where I want you to weigh in, Mom, or maybe you have an edit to this paragraph, comments are your friends, track changes are great. But no, she never came to 2019. She was still firmly back in 1974, when she was writing on legal pads. So it was a challenge, but it also was a lot of fun once I accepted that she was not going to change. Because I did spend a couple months like trying to encourage her to change, and then I just had to accept, that wasn't going to happen. And hopefully this would enable us to laugh along the way of kind of the hard but gratifying work of writing this together.
So Chelsea, was there anything surprising of what your mother's picks that you were surprised about? Out of 200 people that
What was not surprising to me, but really did feel like a gift, was so many of the women that she selected were women whose stories I had grown up with, and to kind of revisit those memories and how still vibrant those were for me when I intentionally thought about them, I guess maybe was a little bit surprising. Like, I really do remember her talking to me as a little girl about like Geraldine Ferraro, and then taking me to go see her when I was 4.
Wow.
Like, what a big moment that was. But I hadn't really thought about that until we were in this process together. And that was an unexpected kind of real pleasure to be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like, I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but I totally remember like getting all dressed up and like going to see her, and my mom telling me she was running for vice president, and like how exciting that was as a kid.
It's so funny because one of the things that I was struck by was the difference in our experiences generationally, because when I was a little girl, I did not know any woman who worked outside the home except for my teachers and public librarians. Those were the women that I had contact with who were working and who I looked up to, but none of my friends' mothers worked outside the home. It was kind of a typical post-World War II suburban, outside of Chicago neighborhood. And so I was constantly looking for other ideas about what women could do, really at the urging of my own mother, who was very intent upon opening my eyes and expanding my horizons. And so these were searches for me. Brenda Starr was a character in the comics, and I thought she was amazing. She had flaming red hair. She was a international, correspondent. She traveled all over the world. She fell in love with a guy with an eye patch. I mean, it was just so, it was so romantic and exotic. But so was Anne Frank, and so was Helen Keller, and so was Maria Tallchief, and so was Margaret Chase Smith, and women that I met in the pages of Life magazine or on our TV screens, because there weren't very many women in my elementary school curriculum who were held up as historic figures. Joan of Arc, maybe, Queen Elizabeth, maybe. So it was fascinating for Chelsea to say, well, when she was a little girl, most of her friends' mothers worked, and she had a totally different experience. Right. And I found that a really interesting distinction. So you were much more accepting and not quite so surprised about the roles that women played.
Well, when I was a little girl, my pediatrician was a woman. I remember when our mayor in Little Rock kind of became a woman. And so it wasn't only, Vanessa, the women in my life, like my mother's friends or my friends' mothers. It was also kind of these powerful figures. The head of the Children's Hospital was a woman. Right. And I think that really was just a different world within a generation, kind of for me to grow up in, of what, in the best sense, I just expected. That I hoped for, but also that I expected.
Yeah. Now, I listened to the Howard Stern interview, which was brilliant. And can you tell the story, talking about never seeing a person, can you tell about the story about when you went in as the female lawyer in Arkansas, and how, I won't give it away, but you're a trailblazer, and not a lot of people had seen you as a female lawyer. It's an amazing story.
Well, who knew that I would have an interview of 2 hours and 21 minutes with Howard Stern, but it was quite an incredible experience, and one of the best interviews I've ever had. And we were talking about, my life experiences, and to some extent his own, because of where they overlapped. And I was talking about how when I started practicing law in Arkansas, and I would go out into particularly rural areas, I might have been the only woman lawyer that anybody had ever seen. And I remember trying a case in a county in North Arkansas, and we broke for lunch, and then I came back into the courtroom, and there were a group of men, all dressed in hunting camouflage, who were sitting in the front row of the courtroom, and I just thought it was so odd. They hadn't been there in the morning, and all of a sudden, there they were. So I asked the bailiff, who are they? And they said, oh, you know, they're out, you know, they're deer hunting, and they came in for supplies, and they heard there was a lady lawyer in town, so they came over to see. And so it was those sorts of experiences that, you know, I had in my own life. I sometimes talk to the young women who work for me or who were part of my campaign, and I sometimes feel like they're looking at me like, well, what century were you part of? Because I also remember very clearly how in mid-1970s, I applied for a credit card. I was married by then, so it would have been 76, 77. I applied for a credit card, and I was turned down. And I was told, you know, that I could be added to my husband's credit card. Mm-hmm. And, you know, had to pass a law to get rid of that. Or growing up, and, you know, there were no sports or athletic activities for the vast majority of young women in America. I played half-court basketball. That meant you ran to the center line, you stopped, and you had to pass over the line, and there were three girls on each side, until Title IX passed. And the year before Title IX passed, there were how many girls playing soccer?
The year before Title IX passed, there were about 700 girls playing serious competitive soccer at the high school or the college level. In 2018, there were 390,000. Playing serious competitive high school or collegiate or even middle school soccer. So, you know, I actually met someone, I didn't even tell my mom this, I met someone who came up to me yesterday on the street who is on the Canadian national fencing team, and she's here training, and she said that she was reading our book, and she's like, I'm here because of Title IX. Yeah. She's like, I went to college here because of the NCAA system, and that then has enabled me also to stay here. And she's like, I don't think I would be on the Canadian national team without Title IX. And in the recent Women's World Cup, it wasn't only kind of so many of the American women who were American collegiate soccer stars. So many of the stars on other countries' teams had also been American collegiate soccer stars. So Title IX has changed the face of women's sports, not only here in America, but really around the world.
Yeah, and we write about the three women who were responsible for it. You know, two women members of Congress, Patsy Mink and Edith Green, and a woman researcher, Bernice Sandler, who they did this because they were really upset by the inequity. And so many of the things we now take for granted that are open to girls and women, although we still have a lot of work yet to do, are because of the gutsy women and women like them in this book, who knocked down those barriers, who said, wait a minute, we're not going to, you know, give up, we're going to keep going. And I know in your own life, Vanessa, you've overcome so many obstacles and barriers, and so you were a kind of pathfinder, pioneer for young women and girls coming after you. Who did you look up to when you were, you know, starting off in your career?
Well, I had the support of my parents, for sure. My mother's in the audience, but my mother told me very early on, you're going to have to do better than everyone else just to be considered equal. So I knew that growing up here in a predominantly white environment, but also having to be excellent. So I was a Girl Scout, I was in the marching band, the choir, I did theater, I did all those things to be a multi-talented performer, but that would allow me a skill set that would allow me to achieve things. So between my mother, and then of course like Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, Cicely Tyson, all these people that I've had the luxury of being able to work with in my lifetime, but these are strong women that were trailblazers that opened the door for me. So, and one of my big things, which you mentioned in the book, is faith. So many of the women that you mention have faith. What does faith mean to you?
You know, it's really true that, you know, for me, having faith and a faith that connects me to the larger world and the world beyond is an instrumental part of my understanding of who I am, and also a source of resilience, to know that you can be knocked down, but you can get back up, to know that love is the most powerful force in the universe. And if you're lucky enough, as you were and I was, to have parents who loved me and set high expectations, but were there for me unconditionally, to try to figure out how to convey that and model it, is all connected to my faith. And I grew up going to church, going to Sunday school. I grew up with a great youth minister who took me to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak when I was in junior high school, opening my eyes and my mind in ways that I had never had even imagined. And it was all linked to faith. It was all linked to what kind of person you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to treat other people. So it's been a major motivator in my life. And a lot of the women in our book are women who've been knocked down, who've been marginalized, who've been criticized, who've been sometimes brutally beaten for what they believed, sometimes terribly assaulted and left to die, who've been exiled, who have been imprisoned. And one of the characteristics that you find with them is that they hung on to that faith. And it was not just a faith in themselves, it was a faith in their ability to do something bigger and greater than themselves, because they were part of a greater sense of possibility and hopefulness. And for me, that's spiritual and religious, and it makes a big difference, because it's hard to keep going in the face of all sorts of challenges unless you can dig deep down and think, I really have to do this. I have to do this because it's going to help somebody else. I have to do this because it's going to make a difference.
It's Cicely Tyson's 95th birthday today.
Yeah, today's her birthday.
Today's her
I'll have to
birthday.
give her a call.
And so I was thinking about her, and we write about her in the book because she was at the unveiling of the Shirley Chisholm monument in Washington, D.C. with my mom, and she has spoken so eloquently about her faith and kind of her faith in action kind of throughout her career, and her activism and her kind of persistence and just kind of unwillingness to ever kind of give up or give in. And clearly, like, growing up kind of with my mom and with the values of kind of faith being not just something that we practiced on Sunday, but being connected to our lives and to kind of what my grandmother always called the discipline of gratitude, is something that I am especially grateful for now as a parent. And trying to help my children, and they're little, but I just already shared that my mom took me to see Geraldine Ferrara when I was 4. So I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-month-old, of helping them understand kind of these stories of faith in action, but also optimism in action. Kind of, because why else would any of these women have worked so hard if they didn't kind of feel a calling to it, but also the belief that their energies and efforts could make a difference. And so I just am so thankful to my mom for giving me that sense of possibility, but also responsibility, candidly, that I now am trying to give to my own children.
So being a new mom and being in the times that we are you optimistic about where our nation is going?
Well, Vanessa, I think a lot about something that Jim Kim, who was one of the founders of something called Partners in Health with Paul Farmer, kind of to help really transform kind of healthcare first kind of in Haiti and Peru, and then increasingly really around the globe, said a long time ago, and then has repeated since, that optimism is a moral choice. And I just think we have to make the moral choice to be optimistic, because this is not the world. This is so fundamentally not the world that I want my children or any child to grow up in. And so then I have to believe that we can change the world so that it is not the world that they grow up in. And I do think that the way kind of the forces who want want this darkness that I think is permeating so much to become inevitable, is that they are relying on us to lose our optimism, and they are relying on us to become exhausted, and they are relying on us to lose our faith. And that actually just girds me even more fundamentally to my faith and to my optimism and to my determination to just like get up every day and do whatever I can in the kind of small world of my family and in the larger world of our shared community.
Yeah, you know, I have to say, that's a really important insight that we drew from all these women, because they were optimistic. You know, I write about several women who I just am in such awe of. So one is Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in planting trees in Africa. She started a movement to try to reverse the effects of deforestation and climate change. And she recruited women to plant seedlings. And by the time she died, she'd planted 50 million of them. But it was in the face of implacable opposition. Opposition from, you know, landowners, opposition from the government in Kenya, where she was from, to the extent that she was beaten up and, you know, severely injured because she was planting trees, and she was also speaking out against some of the decisions of the government that were bad for the environment. But she never quit. She never gave up. Or Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who became the first woman elected president of any country in Africa. And she had been arrested, imprisoned, exiled. She came back. She, you know, ran again. She got elected. She got elected not once but twice. And I remember visiting her for her second inauguration, and she asked me if I would speak to her parliament. And she said, you know, in my parliament are war criminals, and I have to work with them because our country can't take any more disruption. We've sent some of them off to be tried for war crimes, but we're left with a group that we know but can't prove and can't deal with under our system, who did terrible things. I want you to go speak to them and talk about how hard it is for countries to, you know, overcome the past, but how necessary it is to be optimistic. So, I mean, there I am standing in front of, you know, folks, and I'm looking around saying, okay, which one's the war criminal, you know? Or I think about Michelle Bachelet, who was arrested by the government of Pinochet, the dictator in Chile. Her father was arrested. He died in prison. She and her mother were arrested. They were tortured. Then they were exiled. Eventually, she got to come back, and she became a pediatrician. She started working to improve health for kids. She gets elected, and she really wants to make a difference. Well, you can't imagine being able to keep doing that unless you were optimistic. Optimistic not only about yourself, as important as that is, that you can get back up, you can, you know, face the challenges, but optimistic about what other people are capable of doing for the better. And I think what Chelsea said is so important, because we're in a struggle. We're in a struggle for the soul of our democracy, and it's not only our democracy, but it is democracies in the rest of the world as well. We're in this struggle, and if you want to be sort of picturesque about it, it's a struggle between light and darkness, and people who really do want to crush your spirit, who want to belittle, demean, and discard you unless you believe and fall in line with what they are trying to make you think and do. And they're trying to recast reality in the face of facts and evidence and truth. So you have to be optimistic. You have to believe that, you know what, there are more people like us who care about evidence, truth, facts, rationality, who care about treating people civilly, respectfully, who care about coming together to make decisions, and we're just not going to quit. We're not going to give up. We're going to keep going.
And you know, just kind of one other point, particularly I think though connected back to kind of faith and faith in a particular religious context, in that after after the tragedy of the murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and kind of following on with the rise of anti-Semitic attacks in New York City, the NYPD deploys, I think, every week, at least it's been every week at our synagogue, outside our synagogue. And so when we go to synagogue and church every week. So our kids do have lots of religion in their lives. We go to synagogue, we go to church. But it is like our daughter, she's 5, she notices Vanessa. So she's like, she says like Shabbat Shalom to the police officers, and thankfully they're always very nice to her. But we don't ignore that. So we try to have age-appropriate but very real conversations. Or, our kids like ride the subways and the buses, and sometimes ICE has been on the subways and the buses. And it hasn't happened when she's been on the subway or the bus yet, but it could. And so I know that I've been criticized by the right, we try to protect our kids. Like, why does Chelsea Clinton have all these horrific conversations with her children, and then why did she talk about it openly? Because I would rather my daughter understand in a way that is age appropriate for a 5-year-old, but not disconnected from reality. What is happening? Because I don't want her to be more scared if something were to happen, but I also want her to start to feel the sense of responsibility for what we don't want to have to accept, and what we don't want to be silent about, and what we do want to change. Because there are a lot of kids who don't have the safety or the privilege that she has, and I want her to also start to understand that, because hopefully that is how we start to change where we are for her future and their future as quickly as possible.
Amen. So next year marks the centennial of women's suffrage in the United States. What can everyone here today, both men and women, do to help finish the work? And do you think that we will finally elect a woman president?
Well, I have a few opinions about that. Boy, I sure hope so. I think it is way overdue, but we'll have to work really hard for it, because it is the 100th anniversary next year of women's suffrage, the passage of the 19th Amendment. And that means that it's been literally a blink of an eye in human history, and less than half the existence of the United States that women have been allowed to vote. But of course, just passing the amendment didn't guarantee that all women would be given the right to vote. It took the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act for Black and other minority women to have a legal guarantee that they could vote, but that took an enormous amount of sacrifice and hard work by millions of people. And then we know that we're facing organized efforts to cut people out of voting right now. In many states in our country, people are being purged from the voting rolls. Their registration forms are not being accepted. Look, I believe that Stacey Abrams should have been the governor of Georgia if the vote had been fair, and if the registrations had been actually put into the system. So we have a lot of work to do, and that is something that everybody can be part of. Number one, vote every time you have a chance to vote, and especially if you're a young person. Do what you can to support voting wherever you live, and do what you can to support people who are waging the battle to guarantee the right to vote in places that are blatantly trying to prevent it, like Georgia, or just now Wisconsin, trying to purge 234,000 voters. Now look, there's a process for purging people if they've moved and they didn't tell you, or they don't show up, but this is a bludgeon. This is to try to get rid of young people, minorities, anybody who won't vote the way that the folks in charge want to see you vote. So we have a lot of work to do, and we should use this 100th anniversary, which coincides with a presidential election, to get that work done.
Well, and also in Georgia, who purged 309,000 voters this week, just seems a little bit suspicious given that since the last election, 304,000 new people had registered to vote. So that just seems like a little bit odd to me. But I do think Stacey Abrams has just been so gutsy and extraordinary in how she kind of dealt with her, I think, illegitimate defeat, but also with what she is building through her organization Fair Fight to help ensure that the right to vote is protected in Georgia. And I hope that if this is something you care about, not only will you try to register everyone you know and vote in every election, as my mom said, but really look at what she's doing and see if you can support her in Georgia, but also kind of learn from what she's doing to figure out how to help expand that work and extend that work really around the country.
You write about Sally Ride in the book. She started out as a tennis player, which I did not realize, before she was an astronaut. And when asked why she made her decision to be a scientist, she answered, a bad forehand. So can you share a little bit about your friendship with Sally?
Well, she was someone who I just admired from afar before ever I got the chance to meet her. And she was one of Chelsea's real heroes when Chelsea was growing up. And so when Chelsea was a little girl, we sent her to space camp because she was fascinated by space and astronauts, which was especially poignant to me because when I had been a young woman and President Kennedy announced the space program, I wrote to NASA and said, well, you know, how could I get to be an astronaut? And they wrote back and said, sorry, we're not taking girls. So I was particularly excited when Sally Ride was the first American woman to go into space. But then Chelsea has a sort of sweet, bittersweet story about when she met Sally Ride.
Yes, well, the first time I met Sally Ride at my space camp graduation, I literally was so overwhelmed that I tripped over my own feet and fell in front of her. Yeah, oh, thank you for the question. It was like, oh, yeah, because I was mortified. I was like 12 or 13, and I really, like, think I turned like bright tomato red. Like, it was really even more painful by my painful reaction to it, and she could not have been nicer to me. And I think what is so extraordinary, though, about her, Vanessa, is that she was in the first class. You know, she saw the ad in the Stanford Daily, like where NASA was like advertising, like, "Hey, we're now accepting like not just white men. Like, please apply." And she applied, and she was in the first more diverse cast of kind of potential astronauts. In 1978, she becomes the first American woman in space. She kind of goes back to space a second time, and then she does two things that I think are really like pretty extraordinary. Like, she could have said like, I'm done, but she went back to teach at the University of California at San Diego, and particularly worked to mentor women students she thought would go on to PhD programs, because she was determined to like change the face of like PhD physics, not only at San Diego but elsewhere. And then she created, a real platform of programs for especially like later elementary and middle school girls, because we know that that's when girls start to feel like their interest in math and science is less valid. Mm-hmm. It's when kind of they start thinking, maybe I don't want to be an astronaut, maybe I don't want to be an engineer, maybe I don't want to be a physicist. And that she was so determined to change the future of real, like not only physics but astronauts, that she did everything she could in her lifetime to build the pipeline, and recognizing that had to start with like 9, 10-year-old girls, I think was pretty innovative when she did it, and certainly really gutsy.
And we also write about Mae Jemison, who was the first African-American woman astronaut in space. Another great story of someone who just persevered in the face of rejection and became a great spokesperson for science and space in her later careers. And we write about two young women, Reshma Sajani and Kimberly Bryant, who saw the need for teaching young girls how to code, how to be comfortable with and work with computers. because ironically, there were more women graduating with degrees in computer science in 1980 than there are today. And part because the whole culture around technology and computers was kind of captured in a way by a certain group of, mostly young men who were, fascinated by it and absorbed by it, and kind of created a whole computer culture around the science. And so both Reshma and Kimberly saw this big need, and Kimberly is an engineer, African-American woman who wanted her daughter to be exposed to it, and Reshma, felt the same way. She's a first-generation Indian-American refugee with her family from Uganda. And they wanted to fill that pipeline that somebody like Sally Reed or Mae Jemison were the models of achievement.
Well, and I think what is so moving really about Kimberly's story is she realized that nothing had changed when she took her daughter to a coding camp at Stanford. Her daughter was 10 years old, because she thought like she was the only woman in her engineering classes at Vanderbilt. She'd been the only woman to be in her AP physics and math classes in high school. But she's talked about, she just assumed things had changed, and then she took her daughter to this coding camp at Stanford, and she realized when she was picking up her daughter that she was the only girl that walked out of the building. She was like, what happened? Nothing's changed? Yeah. And she said that was the moment she realized, oh, well, I now have to help change this. Because I don't want my daughter to be singular. It's not good for her, but also, how much potential are we losing? And now her daughter is in her sophomore year as an engineering student.
Fantastic, fantastic. I have some questions from the audience. The first one is from Gabriela Tavares. She says, what advice would you give a third-year law student as she's seeking her career path?
Well, first of all, I think the law remains a great career for young people, and particularly for young women, in part because there are so many things you can do with a law degree. You have to decide what you feel motivates you. And maybe that is through internships or, a job that you start with and then you try something different, whether you go into, traditional law practice, whether you go into some kind of advocacy law work, whether you go into government or politics. I just think your third year, you should explore what you really care about. When I was a third-year law student, what I really cared about was children and how children were treated by the law, and whether we could make improvements so that kids had, better protections as well as better opportunities. And so I went to work for the Children's Defense Fund. A lot of my classmates were going to go clerk on courts, or they're going to work in big law firms, they're going into corporate counsel offices, or going to teach law, whatever the options were. But nearly every one of them, not all, but nearly every one of them has changed their form of law practice or using their law degree for other purposes in the years since we've been out of law school. So you just have to try some different things, and you have to feel good about what it is you're doing with your law degree. But it gives you a lot of flexibility. So I'm one who continues to encourage people who say they're interested in the law to pursue it.
Now, growing up with two lawyers as parents, was there any pressure in your house?
No, thankfully. There was
just a lot of arguments. So.
Well, there was lots of pressure to do my best.
Yeah.
And to always kind of finish what I started. And there was also just so much support because I loved ballet. It was my great love, and I was never going to be a professional dancer. I was not going to be Vanessa Williams when I grew up. That was never going to be a possibility for me. My talents did not match my love, and my persistence did not sufficiently kind of raise my level of talent. And my parents were so good though about saying you should totally love this. You should love it. You should dedicate time and energy to it. And you also, though, should find something else that hopefully you love that you really can, be good at. And they somehow navigated that in a way that was affirmative, but also was like, oh yeah, okay, I need to listen to that advice. And I have always really loved public health and have felt kind of most drawn to to the field of public health. And I teach at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, and I'm really thankful that my parents, although both lawyers, really encouraged me to get my PhD and supported me in doing that. And so I do hope that for some of you who are thinking about, oh gosh, now do I have to go to law school? You don't, to change the world. There are lots of ways to change the world. And I'm thankful that my parents really did believe that it wasn't just kind of rhetoric. They really believed there were lots of ways to change the world, but probably the best kind of support they gave me was the real kind of appreciation and acceptance of my love for ballet, and the real tough love that that was not going to lead me in the same way that probably Vanessa's parents didn't have to have that conversation with her, because they were like, oh, she is super talented and this could work out for her. And my parents were like, you love it so much and that's great. And you need to think about other things.
So this next question is from Devin Swington. Dear Secretary Clinton, would you be able to run in the 2020 race?
Well, I don't think so. Look, I was so grateful and thrilled by the chance that I had to be the nominee in 2016 and to campaign on what I thought would have made the country safer and more prosperous and more opportunities for everybody. It's really important that I do everything I can to make sure that we retire the incumbent, regardless of what happens with impeachment. That's the role that I am playing. I started an organization called Onward Together. We support candidates and organizations that are working to register voters and convince people to run and help train them to run and take on, difficult challenges like children in cages at the border and other things that need to be addressed. So that's what I'm focused on right now. And I feel really good about that because, as Chelsea was just saying, there's so many things we need to be doing, and there's so much work that needs to be done right now in America. And it's not certainly all political, but much of it is, because we've got to get our politics back on a more even keel without all of the vitriol and the meanness and the divisiveness. So that's really what I'm doing in 2020. I'm going to try to make sure that we get everybody to vote, and we get all those votes counted, and we get a new president. That's what I think we all should be working toward.
This next question is from Dr. Kristen Cooper. Secretary Clinton, what has kept you inspired? What, after years of advocating for better health care, has kept you believing we can do better as a nation? How can individuals advocate for comprehensive preventative care in the U.S.?
It's a great question, Doctor. And let me answer that and then let Chelsea chime in, because as she said, she teaches public health at Columbia and has a PhD in global health, so she has a broad international perspective. Here's what I would say. I think that we need to do three things when it comes to health. We need a system that works for everybody to provide quality, affordable health care. Full stop. And with the Affordable Care Act, we got to 90% of coverage. And if you look at how we provide health care right now in America, through Medicare, through Medicaid, through the VA, through the Children's Health Insurance Program, and through the Affordable Care Act, we have 90% coverage, which is still a 10% gap, but we have rising costs because we haven't yet figured out how to provide quality, affordable health care without people having to go into debt, go into bankruptcy, forego care, not be able to take care of themselves. So I want to see us have a robust debate. Now, you may not have known this before you came in, but a bunch of a bunch of states run by Republican officials sued the government over the Affordable Care Act, claiming that the Affordable Care Act had no right to mandate people to get insurance. And a court has just said today, this afternoon, that there should not have been an individual mandate. Now, I worked on this, as some of you know, back in 93 and 94, and in our existing system, you had to have an individual mandate because not everybody had health care through their employer, or they weren't old enough for Medicare, or they weren't eligible for Medicaid, or the VA, or when I helped to start the Children's Health Insurance Program, they weren't eligible for that. So you had to get everybody into the system. And now if this court has its way, which, it looks like it will, the whole Affordable Care Act will unravel. Yet another reason to defeat the current president and everybody who voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act under his administration. So we have a lot of work to do to get a system that works. And, there are different ways of getting to a universal health care system. Some people are all for Medicare for all. Some people are all for what they call Medicare for everybody who wants it. Some people want to still have a mixed system, which many other countries do, that cover everybody, but they have a public system and a private system. We just need to have a system that provides quality, affordable care for everybody, and nobody is left out, and nobody is dropped out. And we need to make sure we cover pre-existing conditions, which is one thing the Affordable Care Act did, and that we keep young people on their parents' policies, which is another thing the Affordable Care Act did, and that insurance companies don't put a limit on the care that you are entitled to have when you are sick. And, you can see, don't get me started. There's a lot that we need to be doing. And I hope that the political debate and now this court decision convinces Americans that this is no longer theoretical. If this court decision is implemented, which it will be if Trump is reelected, then you will lose coverage under the Affordable Care Act. You will lose the protection that you have now because of pre-existing condition coverage and so much else. So this is no longer theoretical, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could do something and get everybody covered? We're going to lose the progress we've made under this court decision. So we've got to do more on a system, but we also have to do more on wellness and prevention and people taking steps to keep themselves healthy and keep their families healthy and to know how to do that. Because sometimes it's not always so easy. If you don't live where you can afford to buy fresh vegetables or they're not even available, you can hear all the lectures in the world about eat more fresh vegetables, and you know what? You can't afford them, you can't get them. And the Trump administration just kicked 700,000 people off of food stamps. So we are not coming up with a sensible approach. And I feel really, really strongly that this should be the key issue in this election. Who is for quality, affordable health care, whatever the system is, we'll get there. Who is going to incentivize wellness and prevention, and who is not? And who wants to go back to the old way that leaves people out and leaves people less healthy and more desperate to get the care that they deserve to have?
And who believes in science, and because I do really struggle with kind of the assault on science and evidence and facts in general, but particularly in conversations around health. And we're seeing this play out so painfully around vaccines. Earlier this week, something that I had thought was going to pass was defeated in the New Jersey state legislature, where it looked like they were going to really limit the exemptions around vaccines. And yet, so many protesters showed up with their totally fact-free, untethered from medical evidence rhetoric around vaccines causing autism and sterilization and just general unspecified harm. And they literally drowned out the debate, and I think exhausted the legislators, and the legislators left that day without having passed, limiting the possible exemptions. Why is this so important? Well, vaccination rates in New Jersey have been higher actually than in New York, so they haven't had the same, hundreds of measles cases that we've had here, including 17 kids who were in critical care last year, some of whom are forever going to have their lives altered by the fact that they were afflicted with measles. But their vaccination rates are at 94%, and they're dropping, right? So they're losing herd immunity. And so there was the right impulse of we should make it harder for people to not vaccinate themselves and their kids so that we preserve herd immunity, so that we're protecting those like my 4.5-month-old son who is not old enough yet to be vaccinated, or those who are immunocompromised, who have lost their immunity because they're on chemotherapy or other medical treatments, or the very few number who cannot, for other medical reasons, actually be vaccinated. But unfortunately, the anti-vaxxers won, at least temporarily, in New Jersey. And the fact that they won while we are having measles outbreaks around the world, in Samoa, where more than 70 kids have now died, is so painful to me. But it says to me, yet again, these anti-science, anti-evidence, anti-fact forces are potent and they're powerful, and we see it so clearly, not only around Donald Trump, but in debates around climate change that shouldn't be debates, in debates around vaccines that shouldn't be debates, because the science is settled. And I just think for those of us who feel this way so strongly, it's not only continuing to advocate for the science, but continuing to push back against the both sidisms, because there is not a both sides to vaccines, and there is not a both sides to climate change, and there is not a both sides to whether or not a swastika or a Confederate flag is a symbol of hate. And the both sidisms is going to kill us, because it is killing us right now. So I just think we cannot cede this ground, and we cannot allow our legislators to be scared, because it is probably really scary when 6,000 people show up outside the New Jersey State Legislature and people bang drums, and you have kids kind of appropriating the language around the pro-choice debates to say my body, my choice with vaccines, let me go to school. I get it, it's scary, but this is why you were elected. So please do your job, but the rest of us have to support them so they can do their job. And clearly, as my mom said, she has her strong feelings about things. I feel this really intensely. But I feel okay about that, because it is only the future of public health, which means it's only the future of the human species.
Yes, exactly.
So.
We have time for a couple more questions. This one is from Wendy Wallner. As a woman entrepreneur, how do I manage being assertive and strong and still likable? How do others get to ever know the real you?
Oh, if I only knew. This is the classic conundrum for women in the public arena, whether it's politics or business or academics or media or entertainment, whatever it might be. And, I have two answers to this. One is, look, there are tactics and strategies that you can learn and apply. Having a sense of humor, not taking yourself too seriously, coming up with some, good responses when you're in that inevitable meeting and you make a point, nobody pays attention, and then a man a minute later makes the same point, and everybody tells him what a great point it is, and then you say, well, I'm so glad he agrees with me, or whatever it is that you think would, kind of cut the tension but make the point. And find solidarity with other women and men who want to support you in your career, in your business, or your profession, whatever it might be. But also, we've got to change the dialogue. When was the last time you saw a public male figure being debated as to whether or not he was likable? Because that's just not in the vocabulary when you look at men. They get credit for being aggressive and assertive. They get credit for being strong, for, really grabbing, the opportunity that is provided. And we're still living in a kind of paradigm where, women and girls are held to a totally different double standard. One of the things that Chelsea and I saw a few months ago was a report about one of the big accounting firms that, in all good faith, as they thought, were trying to help the women in their firm get ahead. And so they contracted for a training skills program. And the training skills program came in and basically reinforced every stereotype you can imagine. That, women should be soft-spoken. Women should be gentle. Women should not be too assertive. And women should try to essentially hide their ambition. I mean, you could have had that same advice given in the 1950s. So part of it is owning who you are, figuring out how best to present yourself, and taking advice from people whom you trust, who can say, well, maybe you could have offered it this way, and maybe that would have been more effective. Certainly keep learning about how you better present yourself. But do not take criticism personally. Take it seriously so you can learn from it, but don't let it knock you down or hold you back. And be in solidarity with other women so that we grow the pipeline and grow the numbers of women who are going to be able to, break down barriers and, try to create more opportunities for those who come after. I'm not saying it's easy, but we all have to keep trying, and we all have to learn and support each other in doing that.
This next question is from Leon Shortall, and he is 9 years old. He asked, who is your favorite baseball team and player?
So, my husband grew up in Philadelphia. And, there was like someone who applied
Any
from
from Philly?
Philadelphia.
No? Okay. All right.
Hey, yeah. So, when we were, when we were engaged, he was like, we're going to raise our children to be like Philadelphia sports fans. And I was like, I don't actually know that. I didn't know that, you assumed that. I'm not signing up for that. We live in New York. And he said, well, no. And I said, well, yes. So we had this long debate, and he got the Eagles. So we are an Eagles family. And, I'm sorry. I just didn't really, we had, compromise in marriages. It's an important thing. So, and we organized basically our entire fall around, him being able to watch the Eagles games, him being able to go to the Eagles games when they're in Philadelphia. He has now taken our daughter, because I was like, it's for our daughters and our sons. If this is all in family, it's all in family, right? The girls and the boys. I also make him talk about head injuries with our kids. They're like, what are you talking about? But that otherwise we were going to be a New York family. So we became it was easy for hockey. We only had one choice if you live in New York City. It was initially easy for basketball, and then we got a second basketball team. And then we had to navigate that. But we had two baseball teams. So this actually was a really this is way more than you wanted to know about my family. We're out of time. I'm sorry you asked this
and
question.
And the answer is
and you thought,
Yankees
or
Mets.
You thought there was going to be one clear answer, right? So we went to both of the games as if we would know. I don't know. We auditioned them both as if they cared about us. And we settled on the Mets. I don't know if that was the right answer for you.
It's not the right answer for me.
It's not the right answer for my mom, but
okay, and here's why.
We liked the stadium. I don't know. I liked the blue and orange. I don't know. We don't really have a good answer, but now we're all in, because then you have kids and you're like, this is what we're doing.
Well, I have a totally different story, which, got me into all kinds of trouble, but it happens to be true, like so many of my stories that get me into all kinds of trouble. So when I was growing up in Chicago, there were two baseball teams, the Cubs and the White Sox, and it depended upon where you lived. if you lived on the north side or in the northern suburbs, you were a Cubs fan, which is where I live. Or if you lived on the south side or the southern suburbs, you were a White Sox fan. So I grew up being a Cubs fan, and you know, it really was one of the great learning experiences of my life because they were so disappointing and so heartbreaking, and you know, 4th of July would come and people would say, they're gonna make it, you know, this is the year, and then of course, you know, it was a big fade out. And so my all-time favorite Cubs player was Ernie Banks, who I adored, and so fast forward when I was First Lady, I got to go throw the ball out. But again, I was First Lady. They never had a First Lady on the mound, so they said, we're not going to put you on the mound. We're going to have you throw it, you know, from the bleachers. Okay, fine. I had practice and everything, but anyway, I threw it from the bleachers. But I got to meet Ernie Banks, and I got to spend time with him. So here's why I'm telling you this story and why I have a little bit of a problem with the solution and choice that my daughter and her family made. So when you are a fan of a constantly losing team, you've got to find some hope somewhere. So I said, look, I can't root against the Cubs, but they're in the National League. So I can root for the Yankees because they're in the American League. And so I became a very serious follower of Yankees baseball for a number of years. When I was like, you know, 7 years old, I was Mickey Mantle for Halloween. I had a little uniform with the number 7 on it and all of that. I saw no conflict whatsoever. So fast forward to Bill being in the White House and, you know, the Yankees, you know, win the World Series, and sports teams actually liked to come to the White House back in those days. And so the Yankees came. I was so excited, and you know, somebody handed me a Yankees cap, and I put it on, and oh my God, thank goodness there was no social media, because I was so roasted in the regular media. What is she doing? She's from Chicago. Why is she wearing a Yankees hat? And I would try to tell this story about I was this little girl. I love the Cubs. I love the Yankees. And I mean, you know, it never, I don't know, never worked. But they, you know, it's fine with me. The Mets are fine. I hope they're going to get better. And because they had so much promise. And I hope the Yankees are going to, you know, return to their championship status. So I'm just going to carry that in my heart for the rest of my life.
So I know we're going over, but I have got one more question. Speaking of social media that you mentioned, what are the biggest fundamental benefits and detriments that stem from the inception of the internet? Would you change anything which digital media has delivered to the public? And are we using this relatively new tool in ways that are hurting or helping American society? Is it bringing us together or tearing us apart? And that's from Jennifer Weisensell.
Jennifer, that is one of the most important questions that we face, not only in our country, but literally in the world. And it's both tearing us apart and bringing us together. The promise of you know, the internet and then social media was to bring us together, and it has in remarkable ways. The opportunity literally to connect with people half a world away, to get information about anything you're interested in within, you know, just a couple of seconds is astonishing. So the breadth of human knowledge and the opportunities for, you know, learning and being part of a broader world village are there. At the same time, we did not understand the dangers that the internet could pose. And the dangers are not only because technology now basically knows everything there is to know about you. Thousands and thousands of pieces of information. And it's not only your phone, it's also your car. It's also your home systems. There is a huge amount of information that is being used to manipulate every one of us. Now, some people gladly give up their privacy. They say, well, you know, it's a price I'm willing to pay. But you never know how it's going to be used against you, and there is so little regulation. The most valuable commodity in the world today is not oil, it is data. and the data is not owned by you, even though we all produce it. And it is incredibly personal, intimate even, everything from your medical records to your shopping choices to your entertainment options. And one of the ways that our 2016 election was manipulated was through acquiring tens of millions, hundreds of millions of data points on nearly 100 million Americans, and then using it to deliver propaganda. So we have yet to come to grips with that element of what the internet has become and what social media has enabled. We also are not yet fully paying attention to the impact on children, on their development of their brains, on how they feel about themselves. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out and said no child under 2 should see a screen. And between 2 and 5, very limited screen time, because it retards your language development, it interferes with your behavior. And you know what's really ironic about this? You know, people in Silicon Valley are putting into the contracts that they sign with the people who take care of their children prohibitions about having their own children look at screens, even though they're creating the screens and creating the content that goes on the screens, because they actually pay attention to this new and very concerning research that's available. And then as children get older, become teenagers and young adults, we're seeing increase in bullying, we see increase in anxiety and depression, we see increases in teen suicides, and a lot of very thoughtful, credible researchers are saying there is a new phenomenon that is impacting how children feel about themselves and the world that they are part of, that is embodied in social media, that creates unrealistic expectations. And you know, really, there's so much about this that we don't yet know, and we're not paying close enough attention. And then the final thing I would say is what's now being used through the internet is the creation of massive surveillance systems. China has taken the best of the internet and moved it into a tool for oppression, for the surveillance of 1.4 billion people. And it is going to be everywhere. Facial recognition is going to be the way that China finds out who you are and what you are doing and holds you to account. So the short answer is we all take advantage of it. It's made, in many ways, life more convenient and easier. But if we don't deal with the downsides, the data sides, the privacy side, the fact of influencing brain development and feelings about oneself as well as surveillance, it will be, on balance, more of a negative than a positive.
And I would just say, because I know we're out of time, this is another reason to vote, because we cannot solve these problems as individual citizens or parents. We do need our elected representatives to regulate social media companies, to hold them to account, and hopefully also to do things like prevent them from enabling the surveillance state in China, which we know is actively actually happening. So just to end kind of on the please don't get exhausted. Please register if you're not. Please register everyone you have ever even heard of. Like, go through the phone book if you still have one. Like, truly. Because I do think it is the future of our planet, it is the future of our public health, it is the future of our democracy, and it certainly is the future for our kids.
We want to thank you so much for giving us the examples of being gutsy women. And before we go, Chelsea, can you tell me why you think your mom is a gutsy woman?
Oh, because she just never gives up.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm so glad that she never gives up.
And why do you think Chelsea is a gutsy woman?
She wrote a book called She Persisted, which could have been about her because of her absolute passion and sense of mission about what she wants to contribute to the world. And everybody can have that. Everybody. There's something everybody can do to be braver, more resilient, kinder, and more grateful. And in this holiday season, that's my wish for all of us. Thank you.
We thank
Thank
the
you, Vanessa.
Clintons.
Thank you, everyone.
Do we have a Gutsy theme song for their exit?